Welcome, then, to this roundtable on the Punitive Society. This is the second meeting after the workshop on the legacy of the GIP, the Groupe d'Information sur les Prisons, about 1 year ago in May 2015 at DePaul University. I wasn't there, I just watched it. That's fascinating. In the meantime, many things have happened, including the publication of the English translation of La Société Punitive a few months ago, the year-long seminar on Foucault 1313 here at Columbia, and in particular the seminar on the Punitive Society with Axel Honneth, Didier Fassin, and Nadia Urbinati and Bernard, presented as Foucault 313, or the very recent publication of the volume Active Intolerance, Michel Foucault, the Prisons Information Group, and the Future of Abolition by Perry Zern and Andrew Dels, with 14 essays and 3 intolerables that we need to read in depth. The Punitive Society marks the time and place where Foucault studied the model of the war of all against all, the emergence of the social enemy, the genealogy of the penitentiary, the theory of illegalisms, the birth of imprisonment. We know quite well the external circumstances in which this seminar was taught. We are still living at the time the consequences of May 68 and the recrudescence of repression, especially promoted under the presidency of Georges Pompidou. It is, as well, the moment of dissolution of the Groupe d'Investigation sur les Prisons, or d'Information sur les Prisons, that had been activated by the model of what the group called the Enquête Intolérance, or Intolerant Inquest. In early 1972, during his visit to the US of A, Foucault had visited the prison of Attica that left an indelible mark on his intellectual activity and his work. In an interview with John K. Simon for Social Justice, Foucault confessed that he had never had the opportunity to visit a prison in France, but that he had information about the pitiful state of French prisons. What impressed him about Attica was something entirely else: the machinery, the dwarfing medieval towers, the entrance à la Disneyland, but also the riots, the political prisoners, the Black Panthers. At the time, Foucault was already working on his book on punishment, a book that would later become Surveiller et Punir. Because they are so rich and the circumstances so extremely complex, these 13 lectures on the Punitive Society, taught between January 3rd and March 28th, 1973 at the Collège de France, sport their own load of incoherent, perplexing elements that are part of a complex process of thought, a thought in the making, a thought constantly critical with itself and with the historical context with which Foucault always responded with action. In fact, the lectures begin by qualifying the noun at the top of his lectures, punishment. I want to justify the title of the lectures and talk about this notion of punishment. If I have taken precisely this dull, naive, weak, puerile notion, it is because I wanted to return to things at the level of their historical developments, beginning with the analysis of what could be called the subtle tactics of the sanction. I will start, he announces, by picking out some of these. It seems to me that we can pick out 4 major forms of punitive tactics, which I will define by verbs rather than nouns. Defining them with verbs means something theoretically crucial, as he will be focusing on actions, on processes rather than on nouns or on nouns or substantive that seem fixed and essential. He wants to understand processes, actions, performances that can be changed, whose directionality can be redefined. That's how he identifies these 4 key actions: to exclude, to organize, a redemption by means of compensation, to mark, and to confine. These 4 tactics cannot be isolated from each other. As they are verbs or actions, they are constantly interacting. The lectures will explain the complexities of those interactions. There is something that seems important in these lectures. Punishment, supplice, in its different forms and other tactics, are part of a literacy. Foucault frequently considers that those subtle tactics of the sanction are part of an alphabet or a grammar. They are part of a linguistic system that has been automatized and is barely visible. a system that is hidden, sleeping sometimes in language itself. Foucault claims that to de-automatize the perception, we need to study the hors text and to delve into the discourses, what he began calling discursive events back in 1970. Focusing on the radically Heraclitean trope of the war of all against all, and on the theory of illegalisms, Foucault will change the direction of analysis current in some of his contemporaries, and we will probably see in the next couple of hours how those paradigms will become crucial to draw a critique of other Marxist and Althusserrian paradigms that were current at the time. On March 28, 1973, by the end of his lectures, Foucault not only recapitulated, he also pushed his research forward. Where was I wanting to go? I wanted to analyze a certain system of power, disciplinary power. It seemed to me, in fact, that we live in a society of disciplinary power. That is to say, a society equipped with apparatuses whose form is sequestration, whose purpose is the formation of a labor force, and whose instrument is the acquisition of disciplines or habits. It seems to me that since the 18th century, there has been a constant multiplication, refinement, and specification of apparatuses for manufacturing disciplines, for imposing coercions, and for instilling habits. This year, he says, I wanted to do the very first history of the power of habits, the archaeology of those apparatuses of power that serve as the base for the acquisition of habits as social terms. This is not only a project of nouns, of substantive, this is a project of verbs, of actions. Now, to talk about all that and much more, we are going to give the floor to our colleagues, and then we will go on with an open discussion. Let me introduce briefly each of them in the order they are, each of you, in the order they are going to intervene. Natalie Cisneros, Assistant Professor of Philosophy at Seattle University. Her recent work appears in Hypatia, a journal of feminist philosophy, Radical Philosophy Review, Active Intolerance, the book I have mentioned before, Michel Foucault, The Prison Information Group and the Future of Abolition, and Philosophy Imprisoned, The Love of Wisdom in the Age of Mass Incarceration. Currently, she is completing a book manuscript that draws on the work of Michel Foucault and Gloria Anzaldúa, as well as other feminists and critical race theorists, to suggest a new approach to political and ethical questions surrounding immigration. Andrew Dultz, Assistant Professor of Political Theory at Loyola Marymount University. These are two Jesuitic institutions, if I am not mistaken. He defines himself as a political theorist whose work focuses broadly on the history of political thought, and in particular the discursive relationships between political membership, subjectivity, sovereignty, and punishment. He is especially interested in the connections between penal policy, race, and identity in the United States. He is the author of Punishment and Inclusion, Race, Membership, and the Limits of American Liberalism, one of co-editors of Active Intolerance, and he is also a founding member of Abolition, a journal of insurgent politics. Perry Zern, visiting assistant professor of philosophy at Hampshire College. Perry received an MA from Miami University and a PhD from DePaul University. He researches and teaches in the areas of contemporary continental philosophy, social and political philosophy, feminism, environmental ethics, and critical prison studies. He is the co-editor of Active Intolerance, and his essays and translations have appeared in the Journal of the American Psychoanalytic Association, Radical Philosophy Review, and Synthesis. Others are forthcoming in Philosophy After Irigaray and Philosophia. And Bernard Harcourt, Isidore and Sybil Sulzwacker Professor at Columbia Law School and ICLS. He also holds an appointment at the Department of Political Science here at Columbia. Bernard is also Directeur de Recherche at the École de Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris. Part of his work takes place in the courts of justice, defending the rights of inmates in the death row. He is the author of many books, including The Illusion of Order, in which he demonstrates the weaknesses of the broken windows policies. His new book, Exposed, Desire and Disobedience in the Digital Age, is available from Harvard University Press. He has also edited Foucault's work both in French and in English, Théorie et Institution Pénale, La Société Punitive, Mal faire des lois, with Fabien Brion, and more recently, Surveiller et Punir in the new Pléiade edition. So now, please join me welcoming our guests, and let's begin perhaps with Nathalie. Or with Per.
I wondered if you.
Oh, okay, then.
You know, actually, I'm not sure that fits necessarily, but I'll begin if you want me to, because I was going to push past the Punitive Society in a way.
Mine are going to do that.
Say what?
Mine are going to do the same thing.
Yeah?
But
Okay, all right. Good.
Okay.
We'll do that then. And we're each going for 12 minutes, is that right?
brief.
All right, we're going to try.
No worries.
So, so welcome all. Thank you, Jesus, for that magnificent introduction, and welcome to everyone for this workshop on the Punitive Society and GIP and the larger issues surrounding the prison today and historically. So, in my earlier intervention at DePaul, and in the course of the course context of the Punitive Society, I tried to suggest an intimate link between Foucault's archaeology of knowledge and mode of discourse analysis, circa 1970, and his political engagement in the GIP. I proposed, as others have, that the conceptual architecture of the GIP related neatly to the structure of discourse analysis, but also that his political praxis in terms of confronting the prisons pushed his theoretical reflections towards both the idea of a political economy of the body, which we see in Surveiller et Punir, and also towards the need to supplement the archaeological approach with a more genealogical analysis of power. So in sum, Foucault's theoretical work in the early 1970s informed his political engagement, and reciprocally, his political praxis reshaped his theoretical writings. Now, I won't return here to the influence of his theory on his political engagement, since we covered that last time. And I will only very briefly rehearse the way in which the political practice then reshaped his theoretical work. Very briefly, because I want to push the discussion a little bit further. So, in terms of the ways in which his praxis influenced the writing of the lectures in La Société Punitive and ultimately the writing of the book Discipline and Punish, I think there are several dimensions to this. First, the focus on the body of the prisoner, on the materiality of the conditions of confinement, on the way in which the prison continues to operate principally on the body of the inmate. That, I think, was very influential in his thinking and helped push him towards the work that we would see on what he called a political economy of the body, right? And so his contribution, or one of the principal contributions of Discipline and Punish, which is to convert a political economy of punishment in the vein of the Frankfurt School, or Rusch and Kirchheimer, to turn that into a political economy of the body, I think in part was learned from, and as he himself suggests in his own words in Discipline and Punish, was learned from the experience of seeing the materiality of punishment. Second, the shift from the analysis of repressive models of power in Théorie et Institution Pénale in 1972 to the productive elements of repression in the Punitive Society and Discipline and Punish, I think clearly comes out of his work there and his visits in Attica, and I've discussed that before. Third, the first-hand experience of prison and witnessing the kind of routinized, homogeneous uniformity of isolated confinement, the intolerable prison conditions, and the daily, day in and day out repetitiveness of prison life, I think manifested to Foucault the sharp difference from the ideals of the prison reformers of the 18th century, thereby revealing to Foucault that the archaeological approach was not sufficient, and that he needed to supplement the derivation, the archaeological derivation, with a genealogical exploration of power. And so the shift, I think, from archaeology to genealogy in part was brought about by his political praxis. Finally, his militant engagements, I think, made him consciously aware both of the seriousness of the struggle that the prisoners were facing, and that everyone is facing in society, and of course the relevance of the model or the matrix of civil war. So it might be possible to summarize all this by saying that the lectures, the Punitive Society and the book, Discipline and Punish, and the militancy of the GIP together formed a philosophical act with a back and forth. What Deleuze would refer to as a theoretical revolution, in Deleuze's words, that was aimed to deconstruct the distinction between political and common law prisoners, to actualize and put in place a matrix of civil war and struggle, and to build alliances in society between critical theorists, political activists, militants, and of course all of the actors in the criminal justice system. Now, while I continue to think that this is that this makes sense and helps with our reading of the Punitive Society and also with our understanding of his praxis, there are certain dimensions that I think are missing from an overly focused 1970s contextual history of the GIP. And so the idea here is that perhaps it takes a few more years for some of the central strands of his political intervention to decant, okay? And because, after all, what I'd like to suggest is that there are other important elements to the GIP engagement that involved dimensions of frank speech, that involved dimensions of a mode of life, that involved dimensions of an aesthetics of existence. Now, these are themes and concepts that flourish in the later lectures, but I hear them in the way in which Foucault and the members of the GIP were proceeding. And so I think that those later notions that come to the surface in the later lectures are related closely to Foucault's engagement and to the engagement of the other members of the Groupe d'Information sur les Prisons. And so it's Foucault's later discussion of the cynics in particular, and of the cynics' mode of life, and of their critique of their environment, all of which are developed in The Courage of Truth, which we'll be reading at the next seminar on Thursday, here, actually, at the Casa Hispanica. It's those dimensions that I would like to explore in the few minutes I have. Now, my claim is going to be modest here. I'm not going to be arguing that the GIP experience shaped the later lectures, nor am I going to be arguing that the GIP practices were influenced by a mode of life modeled on cynic living. Rather, what I'd like to do is simply draw the reflections of each on the other. So, by way of background, of course, the idea of a critical philosophy as a way of living, as a mode of life, that is what Foucault explores in 1984 in The Courage of Truth, and he explores it as being characteristic of the life of the cynics. And there are certain key concepts associated with the cynics, at least on Foucault's reading, that are important here. First, the idea of life as a work of art. The cynic practice is all about a particular mode of life, and on Foucault's reading, this question of the mode of life is inextricably linked, for the cynics, to a certain form of truth-telling, a particular kind of parrhesia. Now, truth-telling, as we know, is not by any means limited to the cynics. There are many different traditions of truth-telling, but the cynics are defined in part by their truth-telling and by a particular kind of truth-telling, which is characterized by the concept of insolence. In fact, intolerable insolence is a term that Foucault uses to describe the cynics. The cynics pushed their frank speech and acts to the extreme, to the point where their frankness becomes insolent. So these first two aspects then, a mode of life and frank speech, come together in the practices that Foucault explores in 1984, as well as other ideas such as indignation, a concept of indignation which is very important, and also the notion of scandal, of what he calls le scandale. And so he'll talk about the cynics in terms of, quote, the form of existence as living scandal of the truth, right? Where he writes about this theme of life as scandal of the truth. And the term that he's using, of course, is the French term scandale, which is intended to kind of speak in words of intolerability and, of course, in insolent terms. Now, I see reflections of this actually in the experiences of the GIP much earlier, right? And so I wanted to highlight maybe 6 aspects very quickly. The first is actually hidden, or in my opinion, masked, but it's perhaps one of the most important, and it concerns the last few and totally innocuous words of the GIP manifesto, which is the postal address, right? The postal address. So all those who want to inform us, be informed, or participate in the work can write to the GIP at 285 Rue de Vaugirard, Paris, 15e. Well, that happened to be Foucault's home. That's his apartment, 285 Rue de Vaugirard. And, of course, one could imagine that the Groupe d'Information sur les Prisons could have used countless other addresses as a postal address to receive the surveys and everything that was coming. I mean, and to experience the full life of this experience, of this prison intervention, because people were coming to 285 Rue Vaugirard and knocking on the door, right? And they could have used the offices of the journal L'Esprit, where the tract would be published. They could have used any countless number, but in some sense, it was his home that he was opening to this struggle. He was investing his life. And I think that that's actually very indicative, in a way, of this cynic mode of living. The second, there's a sense that the prison touches all of us, everyone, all of us in all of our lives. There's the use of the term we in all of the tracts and all of the ways in which the GIP is expressing itself. This we, that of course it's the floating signifiers, the haunting we that always causes trouble everywhere it goes, right? But there's a sense in which you can hear that we are all affected in our lives, right? And the beginning of the tract, the GIP tract, starts, none of us is sure to escape prison, right? We are kept under close observation. And so the way in which there's this sense that it is us in our whole lives that are affected by this is another dimension. Third, all of the words, the discourse, the language that both Foucault putatively, I mean, many of the GIP tracts are not signed. We discussed this earlier. I mean, there's a certain anonymity, leaderlessness, etc. But sometimes we have an idea of who wrote it, and we can see the handwriting. But in any event, the discourse, the language of the GIP that's used to describe the cynics are the same kind of words that are used in these tracts. So the notion of intolerable, the notion of indigne, the notion of scandal. Here's a text from February 1971 addressed to the detained and their families. The situation in prison, it is written, is intolerable. Their lives are indigne of a human being. We want to bring this scandal to full light. I mean, that's one, in one paragraph, we have both the notions. I mean, we have the notions of intolerable, we have the notions of indigne, we have the notions of the scandal. Again, addressed to 85 Rue Vaugirard. Fourth, the parrhesia of both themselves and others is particularly important. Foucault, in one of the tracts, which it seems that he wrote, was speaking particularly of a psychiatrist who had been at the prison Toul and who had spoken in her own voice. And it was all about the way in which she used the I to talk, and it was her parrhesia, her truth-telling about what had gone in there that was of such great importance. And you feel it as well in all of the tracts, really, that they are expressions of truth-telling. Throughout there's this language of moral inadmissibility and the need to hold people accountable. Fifth, the idea of not tolerating the accepted, the conventional, the habitual. Now that, of course, is part of the intolerable that goes very well with power knowledge and with the early 1970s, but I also think it's part of the cynical the mode of life of the cynics. And it's well articulated in that GIP tract from March 15, 1971. That's the namesake of the volume by Perry Zern and Andrew Dilts, Active Intolerance, right? Our enquête is not made to accumulate knowledges, but to increase our intolerance and to make it active, an active intolerance. Okay, so, and then finally, I would say Foucault's language itself is full of that insolence, of what he calls the intolerable insolence. In a radio interview, he's in Canada in April 1971, and he refers to the prisons in France as incredibly medieval and archaic, right? I mean, these are insolent words in this context. Another tract that talks about the detained were left 8 days or more in their own shit. I mean, these are ways of expressing that would have a resonance of insolence at the time at which they were expressed. So, in the end, one could say that the entire GIP enterprise resembled the teaching of Diogenes in the household of Xeniades. And what the objective there of Diogenes's of his teachings was to eliminate the dependence of the dependent. In that case, it was the children of Xeniades. To render them self-sufficient, independent, to practice autarky. In Foucault's words, it involved, quote, an apprenticeship in endurance of battle, an apprenticeship in the form of an armature of existence, which was what characterized Cynic teaching. I think that one can hear this in the GIP. And so here I'll conclude with this passage from a communiqué from January 1972, probably written by Foucault, but it doesn't matter. At the time, he would have been delivering his lectures on théorie et institution pénale. And this was in response to rumors that the GIP had disavowed the prisoners' revolt in Nancy. And the tract reads, Le GIP n'a rien à désavouer. The GIP has nothing to disavow in the forms of collective action that the prisoners have taken, whether to support or to express their complaints. The GIP believes that the prisoners are big enough on their own. The GIP isn't a tribunal, an intellectual tribunal that would judge the foundations of these actions any more than it would be a subversive group that's inspiring those actions. From its foundation, the GIP proposed for itself, not to speak for the prisoners or in their name, but to faire en sorte que, to make it possible that the prisoners and their families could finally speak for themselves, right? And it's that idea of helping the prisoners and their families to be heard, paving the way for them to create their own Prisoners Action Committee, the CAP, which capped the GIP in the sense that once it was formed, the GIP disbanded. Those efforts are one that have at their center, I think, a particular mode of life geared towards independence, simplicity, and autarky that I think we see in the analysis of the Cynics.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
So who's next?
Go down a little bit.
Go down the line.
Thanks, that was fascinating, and I've spent a good amount of time trying to think about the role of intolerance in the GIP's work, but also the shift in tolerance and intolerance in the Punitive Society. So I'd love to go back to that. I also thought for a while about the role of the death penalty in these lectures and in Foucault's work overall, and tried to reflect on the relationship between that and the recent publication of Derrida's death penalty lectures. But my remarks here are going to not relate to intolerance or the death penalty, but focus on two topics that I think link the Punitive Society with the GIP, but also help us kind of separate out these two enterprises, what makes them distinct. And that's going to be sexuality and medicine. So beginning with sexuality. In the Punitive Society, Foucault describes institutions of sequestration as having three functions. Number one, subjecting the time of life to the time of production. Number two, seeming to be monofunctional. But number three, fabricating the social by precisely not being monofunctional. And I'd like to reflect on those last two functions. Foucault asserts that sequestrating institutions are precisely not monofunctional. That is, while they may have a single aim, whether education, treatment, confinement, etc., they do not have a single effect, nor is their work unidirectional. Instead, sequestrating institutions always include what he calls a supplement of constraint or a supplement of control that has no necessary relation to the institution's primary function. He gives the example of schools, whose primary function as sequestrating institutions is to educate. Schools, however, consistently have a supplement of constraint that forbids, he says, sexual conduct through the prevention of heterosexuality and the prohibition of homosexuality, thereby producing an internal norm of sexuality. Other supplements of constraint or control might be the prohibition of drunkenness or the interdiction of uncleanliness, he names these. The purpose of such supplements, Foucault argues, is, quote, to fabricate the social, such that institutions of sequestration are inherently also institutions of normalization. Here we have that dual sense of discipline that we read again in Discipline and Punish, that is, to constrain but also to equip, to restrict, but also to direct. The GIP takes as one of its primary goals, I think, to show that the prison, as an institution of isolation, does more than isolate. Or, to put it in the terms of the Punitive Society, the prison is not monofunctional. Among many other additive effects, the prison suppresses sexuality, frustrates relationships, especially familial relationships, and severely restricts corporal contact, or specific sexual corporal contacts of consensual nature. The GIP marks this at a number of junctures. In the midst of a catalog of rights that detainees are denied, it identifies both visits and, quote, the right to maintain a family, unquote. Later, while delineating the deprivations that are piled atop the privation of freedom, Foucault adds the right to a sex life. Focusing on sex, the GIP insists, much like Foucault does in the Punitive Society, there is, and I quote them, a double repression of sexuality in prison, because the other sex is forbidden and homosexuality is punished. It's almost word for word what we get in the Punitive Society. This sexual repression, even in the banal prohibition of masturbation during visits, is, as Foucault argues elsewhere, part of what makes prison intolerable, he uses that word. Now, while the GIP will grant that suppression of sexuality is a form of control, a means of discipline, and a normalizing technique of the Punitive Society, it will not restrict itself to this analysis, nor even center it as a concern. Instead, the GIP will turn its critical attention elsewhere, first to delineating the costs of this supplement of control, and second, to exploring what political resistance to it looks like. So first, what are the costs of this and other supplements of control? The GIP answers over and over again: abuses, suicides, hunger strikes, agitation, revolts. Prisoners are subject to physical suffering and violence, a deepening of social isolation and mental instability. This is apparent in the number and rise of suicides at the time, which the GIP consistently underscores. Perhaps most memorable being the suicide of H.M., who was placed in solitary precisely for homosexual behavior. Here we see the paradox, I think, of these supplements of constraint. They themselves are not monofunctional. In this case, they do not signify signal the mere cultivation of the worker's body, as we might get from the Punitive Society, but they are an assault on that body, making that body become unraveled and unhinged. But second, the GIP also insists that to be denied sexual expression in prison is a political issue, and to resist that denial with suicide is a political choice. As Foucault observes, and I quote, "But isn't that precisely what characterizes current political movements? The discovery that the most quotidian things, the way one eats or is nourished, the relationship between employee and employer, the way one loves, the way in which sexuality is repressed, familial constraints, prohibition of abortion, aren't these political?" In the preface to the third intolerable pamphlet, Prison Suicides, the GIP marks that while many suicides are the result of control, they recently became part of the resistance. They write in that preface that suicides form another aspect of the detainees' collective intolerance and their appeal to the public. It's really this attention to the costs of supplementary constraints and the possibility of political resistance to them that I think goes relatively missing from the Punitive Society. That would be one comparison. But my second set of remarks concern medicine. In the Punitive Society, Foucault traces the co-construction of the penal and medical systems through which health and innocence, and perhaps a third element, moral fiber, are woven together in a particularly modern way. As he does in Discipline and Punish, Foucault makes much of the co-conspiratorial work of scholarly interest: criminology, psychology, psychopathology, psychiatry, sociology, etc., in the development of modern punishment practices. And as he puts it in the course summary, I quote him, "Medicine as science of the normality of bodies took a place at the heart of penal practice." Of course, as he is writing Punitive Society and Discipline and Punish, he is also involved with the GIP and also the GIS, or the Health Information Group. These organizations have different emphases. First, they move beyond, collectively, the GIP and the GIS, they move beyond the fact of the medical juridical system to attend to the ways that that system denies autonomy to specific bodies. And second, they move beyond the reality that institutions of academic production support this medical juridical system to explore how academics, especially socially conscious academics, can best navigate their ambiguous status within it. So I'll give an example from the GIP and then one from the GIS here. In 1972, France was rocked by a series of high-profile prison revolts. Like many of those revolts, the Toul prison revolt was a prisoner-led resistance effort aimed at denouncing the egregious conditions of detention in a local prison. Thanks to the support of outside organizations like the GIP, the revolt was followed by a large-scale investigation. While this investigation generally focused on, as they say, the psychological consequences of incarceration for both guards and the general population, it paid particular attention to the effects on the mentally ill. Those suffering from mental illness were, on the whole, denied control over their own bodies. They were regularly beaten, restrained in their own excrement, denied the capacity to feed themselves, and severely punished for bouts of depression and suicide attempts. Dr. Edith Rose, the prison psychiatrist, wrote a particularly damning report which undermined the prison and psychiatric practice and her own job security. That is, she used her knowledge to subvert her place as a purveyor of knowledge. And according to Daniel Defer, Dr. Rose was the only GIP member to have behaved as a specific intellectual in the Foucauldian sense. In retrospect, Foucault called her report, and I quote, "a critical event in the history of the penitentiary and psychiatric institution." Now, where the GIP aimed to circulate information about prisons, the GIS, or the Health Information Group, which lasted from 1972 to 1981, focused on the medical establishment, broadly concerned with healthcare for women, for factory workers, and for immigrants. The GIS's earliest organizing concerned the illegality of abortion and its effect on women's health. As one of the first documents, published in 1971, actually notes, women are punished and denied control of their own bodies under this medical juridical apparatus. The question for the GIS was not only then, what are women to do, but what are doctors to do, as an inescapable part of this apparatus. In a 1972 interview, Medicine and Class Struggle, the GIS described itself in the following 3 points. First, as doctors, sociologists, and philosophers, they say, they admit their position of privilege and power. That's the first point. They admit it. But number 2, they nevertheless see themselves as also subjected to this very system in which they work. And number 3, they aim to oppose that system by destroying the secrets that sustain it. They specifically say secrets. The GIS then clarified doctors' ambiguous status in the 1973 pamphlet, Oui, nous avons tant, insisting that they are both failing women and being failed by their own medical education and the government that restricts abortions. The GIP, and this is just the concluding comment here, the GIP and the GIS, I think, differ from the Punitive Society and from Discipline and Punish in these 2 significant ways. First, they attend to which bodies in particular are targeted most by this new penal medical configuration: the mentally ill, women, and immigrants. And number 2, they explore the unique position of academics and professionals as both empowered and exploited. As such, these 2 groups, I think, prompt us to turn our attention to those bodies particularly targeted by the development of our own medical penal apparatus in the United States. Whether intersex bodies, trans bodies, bodies of color, disabled bodies, indigenous bodies, etc. The GIP and the GIS also, however, prompt us to develop a different awareness of our own position today as members of the Academy. To take different ownership, perhaps, over the production of PhDs, and ask ourselves what we can do to resist, in the language of the GIS, the, quote, diffuse anesthesia so well mixed with this whole economic system as to render pangs of conscience for us more difficult, unquote. This is our task.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bernard and Perry, for your really helpful and fascinating comments. My brief comments this afternoon will focus on 2 interconnected topics. First, a consideration of the logics of exclusion, confinement, and elimination, as well as the relationships among and perhaps tension between these logics. And second, the emergence of instruments of sequestration and the fluidity of the state apparatus, which is something Bernard talks about at length in the Punitive Society. I will consider how each of these themes is developed in both the Punitive Society and in Foucault's work with the GIP, and in particular in his interview on Attica. And in doing so, I will suggest the significance of this lecture course relative to techniques of power in the present moment, including the prison and punishment, as well as techniques of power surrounding race, racism, and migration. In this vein, by considering how the Punitive Society can be understood relative to Foucault's prison resistance work, I hope to open up a space to consider Foucault's analyses here alongside contemporary feminist, anti-racist, and decolonizing projects. Foucault opens this lecture series with a discussion of the notion of exclusion. In general, he is critical of how this concept has been used as a way of explaining the, quote, historical, political mechanism of power, end quote, that constructs and comes to bear on those who, quote, may be regarded as abnormal or deviant, and explains that the concept of exclusion is, quote, too broad and above all, composite and artificial, end quote. At the same time, Foucault is careful to note that the notion of exclusion has been in some ways useful, and that indeed he himself has used, and perhaps he says abused, the notion in the past to, quote, characterize, to designate rather vaguely the status given in our kind of society to delinquents, to ethnic, religious, and sexual minorities, to the mentally ill, and to individuals who fall outside the circuits of production and consumption, end quote. The useful critical function of this term, according to Foucault, has been its effect in making visible how discourses and practices surrounding abnormality and deviance have enacted and justified the marginalization or exclusion, to use the term, of these individuals in the sense that they, quote, no longer communicate with others at the level of the system of representation, end quote. Exclusion, then, effectively makes visible a pattern in the realm of representation whereby the construction of individuals as deviant or abnormal covers itself over by denying the marginalized participation in the system of representation itself. But it is because, quote, this notion of exclusion appears to remain within the sphere of representations, end quote, that it fails, according to Foucault, to account for the struggles and relations of power that fall outside that relation. So put differently, the notion of exclusion may be useful in describing the marginalization of the abnormal or deviant in the sphere of representation, but it is also problematic in that insofar as it seems to indicate something like total rejection or expulsion, when behind there are a number of quite specific and consequently definable instances of power responsible for the mechanism of exclusion. That's Foucault. Indeed, the notion of exclusion fails to capture the diverse and particular means by which what we call marginalization or exclusion is enacted. Discussing changing practices of social exclusion and inclusion in a 1971 interview, Foucault distinguishes among exiling societies, killing, torturing, or purifying societies, and finally, confining societies. He describes the contemporary era of confinement as the epoch of normalization, in which practices of inclusion and exclusion preserve and enforce social and economic norms. The confining society, then, practices internment and imprisonment, quote, not only to punish, but also to impose by constraint a certain model of behavior as well as norms, the values and norms of society, end quote. So in other words, as we've been discussing, the prison is much more of a means, much more than a means of either exiling or punishing criminals. It is a complex political instrument that targets and confines individuals deemed abnormal. It is also in connection with his work with the GIP before this lecture course that Foucault begins to think about the relationship between normalization and elimination, and further about the relationship among normalization, elimination, and race. In a 1972 interview about his work with the GIP, Foucault describes how the prison was invented to, quote, eliminate as dangerous a select portion of the population, end quote, in order to enforce economic norms. Thus, the prison, in its fundamental role as a tool not only of punishment, but perhaps most centrally of normalization, simultaneously serves an unlimited function. On the one hand, we might understand this description of the eliminative function of the prison as an example of Foucault's own use of the logic of exclusion, something that, as I've discussed, is a subject of Foucault's own self-critique in the first lecture of the Punitive Society. But I want to suggest that we might alternatively, or perhaps simultaneously, read this discussion of elimination and eliminable populations as in reference to racism and race, and as prefiguring his work on biopower and modern racism in the Society Must Be Defended lectures. In her 1998 essay, Racialized Punishment and Prison Abolition, Angela Davis discusses Foucault's visit to Attica, which he made 8 months after the 1971 uprising and massacre. Davis describes Foucault as being, quote, especially struck by the disproportionately large population of Black men, and remarks that one wonders how Foucault might have responded in the 1990s to the fact that 1 out of 3 young Black men is presently incarcerated or under the direct control of the criminal justice system. In the interview from which Davis quotes extensively in this piece, Foucault explicitly discusses the central role of race and racism in the functioning of prisons in the US, remarking that, quote, in the United States, there must be 1 out of 30 or 40 black men in prison. It is here that one can see the function of massive elimination in the American prison, end quote. But though Davis acknowledges that Foucault understands the practices of imprisonment in the US as functions of a racist state, she agrees with Joy James about the need to move away from Foucault's work in Discipline and Punish and toward an account of the prison that sufficiently attends to the histories and strategies of racism in the US in particular. Davis is particularly critical of Foucault's focus in Discipline and Punish on the prison as an instrument aimed at, quote, and this is Davis, punishing and reforming white wage-earning individuals, end quote. She shows how this emphasis elides the complex strategies of racist and gender oppression that have and do shape the incarceration of those bodies historically excluded from waged public economy, white women and people of color. But though Davis, like others, is critical of Foucault's failure to account for histories and realities of race and racism in this text, in Discipline and Punish in particular, she maintains that in his interview on Attica, quote, Foucault allows for the possibility that the prison's purpose is not so much to transform, but to concentrate and eliminate politically dissident and racialized populations, end quote. Indeed, an understanding of the strategies of confinement as strategies of elimination is consistent with Foucault's stated project in the first lecture, The Punitive Society, of, quote, critiquing the notion of exclusion, or more precisely, its elaboration in terms of dimensions that make it possible both to break it down into its constituent elements and to find the relations of power that underlie it and make it possible, end quote. Elimination should be understood then, not as outside of or resistant to the carceral system, but as operating through specific strategies of normalizing power, which are themselves constitutive of the system. In the same interview, the interview on Attica, Foucault states, quote, the prison is not only punitive, it is also part of an eliminative process. Prison is the physical elimination of people who come out of it, who die sometimes directly and almost always indirectly, end quote. By emphasizing its role in a larger eliminative process, this description of the function of the modern prison underscores the centrality of normalizing power in the contemporary era. This point is underscored by Foucault's short discussion of the death penalty in the first lecture, where he calls the death penalty, quote, a penalty of confinement, end quote, not a break from confinement. The notion that ours is a confining society on the surface seems to reinforce an understanding of the modern prison as a space of containment or perhaps of reform, an institution that contains dangerous individuals and or remolds them. Indeed, normalizing power explicitly justifies its confinement of these marginalized subjects as necessary for the security of the society as a whole. Though for Foucault, the mechanism of the confining society justify themselves as tools of preservation, in their materiality, strategies, and structures, they are actually aimed at elimination. A reading of Foucault's critique of the notion of exclusion in the Punitive Society alongside his interview on and analysis of Attica sheds light on the role that race and racism play in the confining society. In the analysis of the Attica uprising and massacre and the masked assassin, racism is described as a key, if not the key, tool used to fight the revolutionary movement, both inside and outside of prisons. And it is observed that, quote, the entire black avant-garde lives under the threat of prison, end quote. This analysis describes the prison as a tool of racist power that preserves the normalizing social order. In his interview on Attica, Foucault again makes explicit the fundamental connection among racism, massive elimination, and the prison, emphasizing that in addition to being a place of punishment, in the US, the prison has another function. Quote, a role of concentration camp as there existed in Europe during the war and in Africa during the European colonization. In Algeria, for example, during the period when the French were there, end quote. By drawing a parallel between practices of confinement in the US and these historical examples of racist, genocidal, eugenic, and colonial violence, Foucault acknowledges that the prison is not only an instrument of reformation, but is primarily and horrifyingly a tool of racist mass elimination. Prisons in the US, like the concentration camps of European colonization and Nazi Germany, unite strategies of confinement and mass murder for the purposes of racist normalization. In his interview on Attica, Foucault explicitly states that his visit prompted him to think anew about the problems raised by prisons and the kind of resistance that can and should be levied against them. Foucault's conception of a confining society should, as we've discussed, be understood as a normalizing society. Indeed, in the Punitive Society lectures, Foucault established that in the contemporary carceral system, quote, the function of apparatuses in relation to marginality is quite different from the monotonous system of classical confinement, end quote. Instead, he says, this new strategies of confinement function in, quote, fixing individuals to and distributing them across social apparatuses, end quote. It is at this moment, in order to distinguish this new set of strategies, those that fix and distribute bodies in diverse locations from what he calls classical confinement, that Foucault introduces the term sequestration. Quote, they are no longer institutions of the classical type of confinement, but rather of what we may call sequestration, by reference to that kind of arbitral authority that seizes something, withdraws it from free circulation, and keeps it fixed at a certain point for a certain time until the court's decision, end quote. In this analysis, the primary strategy of the carceral or punitive society can be understood as a strategy of control or coercion by various means and in various spaces. Put differently, sequestration is a set of strategies that monitors, controls, and regulates the movement of bodies, a set of strategies that both fixes bodies and distributes and moves them through space. In the context of his introduction and discussion of sequestration in Lecture 12 of the Punitive Society, Foucault describes how this set of strategies has resulted in what he calls a spreading of the instruments of power in the carceral system. He remarks that, quote, what is interesting is the position and interplay of these instruments of sequestration in relation to what we usually call the state apparatus, end quote, is a kind of decentralization of the state apparatus. Foucault makes clear that while he identified a tendency of the state to centralize instruments of punishment in the 18th century, in the 19th century, quote, when we see all these flourishing and proliferating of instruments of sequestration, we have the impression that there is, rather, a spreading that in some sense escapes the state, end quote. This description of strategies of power as immanent, diverse, and fluid, which I think can be helpfully seen as prefiguring Foucault's analysis of biopower in later texts, is interesting for my analysis because of a clear connection Foucault draws between sequestration, the fixing and location of bodies, and the proliferation and power of power in ways that escape the state. Indeed, in the manuscript for this section of Lecture 12, Foucault goes further, stating that, quote, it is not a state apparatus, it is an apparatus caught up in a state node, end quote. Foucault, of course, does not mean that the state is irrelevant. In the Punitive Society, he describes how instruments of sequestration still rely on state apparatuses for a whole system of referrals and reciprocities, and points to how, for instance, quote, the workshop could not function in the structure of the convent barracks if there were not the police or army alongside, end quote. In this way, Foucault's emphasis on fluid institutions and patterns of power resists the primacy of the state in an analysis of power, while at the same time emphasizing the state's critical role in the proliferation of the system. This description calls for and begins to enact an analysis of interstate systems of power. So my suggestion that we can think about this set of lectures as one point to start to consider contemporary questions of global migration. Privileging this analysis of sequestration sheds light on how the structures of power that constitute and come to bear on strategies of confinement other than the prison, the movement and fixing of bodies is controlled and coerced in various locations and through various means. So we can think of, for instance, war, sexual and gender normalizing violence, economic exploitation, other forms of violence, surveillance and regulation, global migration. Indeed, migration is coerced both at the state level through official policies such as migrant worker programs, as Nicholas de Genova has argued, and through interest-rate institutions like practices of the agricultural industry in the United States. In this way, an analysis of sequestration as a set of strategies that not only imprison but also fix and distribute bodies through time and space brings to the fore how the control and coercion of migration must be understood as a function of this carceral system. At the same time, conceiving of sequestration as a primary strategy might help capture how, in the US context in particular, the prison industrial complex acts not only to fix bodies, but also to move and redistribute them for particular purposes. For instance, the prison industrial complex operates not only to criminalize and imprison racialized bodies, but also to alternately relocate bodies previously imprisoned into the labor pool, only to remove and confine them again, all through a kind of arbitral authority of sequestration. Such an analysis suggests not only that the control and coercion of migration is part of the carceral system, but also that perhaps the prison itself is not the only or best location for our analysis of how normalizing power functions in racist massive elimination.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to try and bring, I think, the formal presentations to a close by reaching out from these lectures and from the work of the GIP to a certain degree to think a little bit about prison rebellions, uprisings, strikes, and riots, and particularly to briefly try to give over the floor to an ongoing work labor strike that's occurring right now across at least 7 facilities in the Texas prison system. And in doing so, I'd like to haphazardly perhaps draw a line through a set of events, a set of moments that span this so-called era of mass incarceration in the United States, this period since the late 1960s and early 1970s, which has seen both the exponential growth of the incarceration rate and the targeting of incarceration and the concentration of its effects on identifiable groups of marginalized persons. And this is actually, I think, something that's worth noting, that often in our conversations about mass incarceration, it's the first of that which gets emphasized, this dramatic expansion. Whereas it's the second point, the targeting and concentration of social effects on specific groups, following Natalie's analysis, I think, that actually is paradigmatic about how mass incarceration works. And so Dylan Rodriguez has noted recently that we lose track of the idea that mass incarceration has no mass referent. It has a very targeted referent. Just as there was no mass chattel slavery in the United States, there is no mass incarceration in the sense that everyone in this room is equally likely to be incarcerated. Hyper-incarceration or genocide may actually be better languages to describe it. I want, that is, to think more about the place of specific prison uprisings, not only in Foucault's thought, but in our own thinking and practice. And I want to also affirm the motto of the GIP and put into context, the motto of the GIP of donner la parole, to give over the floor, and put that into context specifically of white supremacy as a political system in the United States. This is to say that my reading of these lectures on Punitive Society and my understanding of the GIP archive is a motivated one. Motivated towards what can help us think about the linkages between the genealogy of the prison form and its specificity, the project of contemporary prison abolition, and the cultivation of a succinctly active intolerance to those things that the GIP, on the title page of their first published pamphlet, identified as the intolerable. Quote, the courts, the cops, hospitals and asylums, school, military service, the press, the state, and above all, the prisons, unquote. So I actually want to start, though, with the present to which I would like for us to be able to attend. So on Monday of this week, incarcerated persons at 7 prisons in Texas began a coordinated work strike. And in a series of flyers, they've issued 5 core demands that have been articulated. The first, I'm going to try and quote as directly as I can from their demands. Quote, meaningful work time. Applied retroactively, when our flat time and accrued good work time equals 100%, we should be entitled to mandatory supervision or parole. Second, repeal and overturn of the $100 medical copay. Medical is a basic human right, and since Texas prisoners are not paid for the labor, they say, it is fundamentally unfair and counterproductive to charge such an excessive copay to wards of the state. Third, right to an attorney on habeas corpus. They note, quote, the current structure, design, and operation of the Texas procedural system dictates that no indigent prisoner in Texas will have the benefit of counsel in raising a valid claim of ineffective assistance of counsel. And fourth, a oversight committee over the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, of Corrections and Justice, a bill that will, quote, restructure our grievance process and create an independent committee to review our grievances off of the unit. This committee will have special investigative powers, like doing a walk-in inspections without any prior notice. 5 days before the April 6th strike began, a national call was issued for a strike across the United States, ecstatically to coincide with the 45th anniversary of the Attica prison uprising, which took place between September 1st and 9th in 1971. And in both the current Texas strike and this national call, the central claim is to end, quote, slavery in America. The national call, the organizers write, who are themselves incarcerated, and I'll quote this at length, slavery is alive and well in the prison system, but by the end of this year, it won't be anymore. This is a call to end slavery in America. This call goes directly to the slaves themselves. We are not making demands or requests of our captors. We are calling ourselves to action. To every prisoner in every state and federal institution across this land, we call on you to stop being a slave, to let the crops rot in the plantation fields, to go on strike and cease reproducing the institutions of your confinement. Unquote. Now, the organizers point directly in their documents to recent series of prison strikes, from the 2010 work stoppage across Georgia prisons, to a series of hunger strikes centered around the Pelican Bay Supermax in Northern California, but which spread to the entire system in the summer of 2013, with nearly 30,000 prisoners refusing meals at one point, to the series of work stoppages organized by the Free Alabama movement throughout the Alabama system in 2014, and hunger strikes and work stoppages at immigration detention centers throughout the United States, most recently at women's facilities targeting specifically the confinement of juveniles as well, with and without their parents. So to think through this a little bit in relation to these texts, though, I want to point to three specific parts of the lectures, I think, to draw out a connection between the work of the Prison Informations Group, these lectures, and then these ongoing events, remembering then this interesting haphazard line of historical context in which these lectures occurred. Just months after the formal ending of the GIP and the founding of the CAP, just a year after Foucault himself had visited Attica, the first time he reported ever having been inside a prison, which was less than a year since the Attica uprising, which was just months after the assassination of George Jackson at San Quentin, and all of which were contemporaneous with hunger strikes and uprisings across prisons in France, at Nancy, at Toul, and at many other prisons across the country. Now, the Attica visit does appear, and we've all sort of touched on it at this point, to be particularly important as a turning point in how Foucault is thinking about the project that he's engaged in, this book that he's writing on prisons. And I'll quote briefly at length from that here, where he first articulates what his original question was. Originally he said, I want to know, quote, through this what system of exclusion, by eliminating whom, by creating what division, throughout what game of negation and rejection can society begin to function? Then he says, that question I ask myself now is the reverse. Prison is an organization that is too complex to be reduced to purely negative functions of exclusion. Its cost, its importance, the care that one takes in administering it, the justification that one tries to give for it, seem to indicate that it possesses positive functions. The problem is, then, to find out what role capitalist society has in its penal system play, what is the aim that is sought, and what effects are produced by all these procedures for punishment and exclusion. What is their place in the economic process? What is their importance in the exercise and the maintenance of power? What is their role in the class struggle? Unquote. And already a lot has been made about the more overt Marxist language that's present both in the Attica interview and especially in these lectures, which seems to recede into the background of discipline and punish. And I'm not sort of interested in that question here today so much as I'm interested in the prioritizing of the economic part of the penal system. And in particular, these places in the text where he begins to talk about the wage form and the prison form that begin to align with each other. And then noting how these current movements in the United States are also drawing our attention precisely to those twin forms. So the three places I want to point to very briefly here, and I'm not taking up any particular order, but just to draw sort of attention to them. Right? So Foucault notes a particular disjuncture that occurs. Part of the problem of understanding the prison is in noting that it arrives at a moment precisely when theory says it should not. Right? And he identifies that the dominant modes, the three models of, quote, actual punishment, he says this in the 24 January lecture, that exist at the time that the prison takes the stage. There's first the model of infamy, that is, you won't need to have an entire apparatus surrounding punishment because simply marking an individual as infamous will be a form of punishment itself, the collective organization of society. This is the very Durkheimian sort of voice that gets picked up here. Second, the model of Talion, right, that there will simply be a direct retributive balancing for particular transgressions and can map to that. And third, the model of enslavement or slavery, that to force an individual to labor to pay off the debts and to force them to engage in despotic control of their labor is itself the mode of punishment. And Foucault insists then that the prison emerges and takes over these discourses precisely in opposition to them. This is part of the puzzle. Quote, the prison in fact is not a collective system of infamy, not graduated in its nature like Talion, or reforming like forced labor, unquote. And so what we have here is a way in which that if we now turn to the United States, the puzzle actually shifts slightly, I think. And is in fact very importantly different, in that each of these three penal models in fact persists precisely through the rise of the prison as it's articulated in the United States. And they do so precisely because the prison in the United States is so deeply connected to the history of chattel slavery, the marking of blackness as infamous, and a constant gradation that occurs in how slaves are going to be treated so they can be maintained as productive labor on plantation systems. And this is partially the claim that Angela Davis makes and Joy James has made, that Foucault, if we use a genealogical method from Foucault and apply it to the United States, our genealogy in the United States has to be traced through the chattel slave system and its replacement with the prison system following the inauguration of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Second moment, which comes immediately after Foucault has diagnosed the failure of these three models to be to succeed and the replacement of the use of the prison replaced it again, is to note then the emergence of the twin forms of the wage form and the prison form. And it's important, I think, in the analysis he gives in Punitive Society, these forms do not cause or immediately bring about the other. They are twins. They like the delinquent in the prison, as it shows up in Discipline and Punish, the wage form and the prison form emerge at the same time. The question, he says, is what actually is the relationship between the two? But they're contemporaneous to each other. And he points, I think, at what he thinks the underlying connection is, and it's the idea of time. That the segmentation of one's labor into a time that can be exchanged for a wage, and the segmentation of one's life into time that can be punished through incarceration, these are the two, this is the underlying condition of possibility for these two forms to arrive simultaneously. But I think it is here that we can then turn to the analysis of specifically the prison rebellions as they're being articulated in our present moment to see precisely how this is working, at least in the United States. It's precisely through the ongoing afterlives of infamy, Talion, and slavery, and then as a current retraction of cooperation in the form of the strike, that we see the responsiveness to the twin forms, and we see a recognition of the persistence of infamy, Talion, and slavery in the contemporary system. This is, as Francis Piven notes, the very essence of a strike is a removal of cooperation from the existing system. That is to say, what marks the prison in the United States is that the prison emerges as an instrument of infamy and slavery in particular in the 19th century, articulated precisely through legal codes that are definitive of the recreation of the criminal system and the constitutional system in the 19th century, focusing on political exclusion for crimes of infamy, and secondly, for forced labor explicitly allowed for under the 13th Amendment. That insofar as the 13th Amendment abolishes involuntary servitude, there is a gaping loophole for punishment as another crime. Likewise, in the 14th Amendment, insofar as the right to vote and due process is maintained for all individuals, except for treason and other crimes. The last moment that I want to point to then is this weird sort of thing that happens in the 7 February lecture, where Foucault does this thing when I've developed, I don't know if it's an allergy or a tick, that every time I see Foucault talk about the current moment, I feel like something strange is happening. There's very rare moments across his corpus when he actually reflects explicitly on the current moment, and there's tons of archaeological work people end up trying to do, is like, well, what is he actually referring to in this moment where the distance of the genealogical method seems to slip. But on February 7th, he notes a, quote, kind of historical symmetry between 18th century dissidents against the prison form and, quote, the present-day movement of moral dissidents in the US and Europe, unquote. And here, actually, he turns to, in particular, work by physicians and doctors fighting the abortion laws that are going on in France at the time as the particular example of this. But what seems to be important about this moment, or what if something shifts or something happens in his attention to the current moment for me, right, is that he wants to note the kind of rejection and refusal that we're seeing in the current moment in the early 1973 in France. And he says that these are refusals that try to undo the culpabilitization of penal institutions. They don't try and escape the law. They don't try to pretend the law is an abstract or unreal or fictitious thing, but they try to directly confront the law and, quote, are an attack on, quote, the intrication of morality, of certain power relations peculiar to capitalist society, and instruments of control assured by the state, unquote. And the rejection here then is not about this escape from law, but a direct confrontation with it. And this is, I think, where both the difference between the Texas demands that have been issued, which have been issued to the Texas Department of Corrections, and the call for the national strike have some important similarities and differences. So first, a few of the key similarities. In both of those moments, and in recent other ongoing forms of rebellion and strikes, there is a recognition that what is at stake in these strikes is a frustration of the wage form, prison form pairing. Those who are most exposed, in fact, to the carceral form turn out to be precisely those who understand this connection the best. The experts on this connection are the currently incarcerated individuals forced to labor under those conditions. Second, and this works directly against the distinctions in kinds of crimes, precisely as the GIP notes. There is no important distinction between political prisoners and Commonwealth prisoners, insofar as the Texas demand for for the wage form to be able for their work time to lead them directly to parole also includes an explicit refusal to attend to the original reason for incarceration as part of parole decisions. They actually want to take it seriously and say, if this is really about reformation, then what we have to actually do is talk about the work that I did here and not why I'm here. It's a very interesting sort of tactical reversal they seem to be engaged in. Right. It is, in fact, then the prison form itself that works with the wage form, which defines this condition of slavery to which these movements try directly to respond. And third, a key part of what's at stake is then a broader intolerance to the carceral. That is, through reconnections to family and supporters both inside and outside the prison laws, which speaks, I think, to some of the points that Perry was making. The reconnection of family supporters into broader campaigns is, as organizers of the California hunger strikes noted, what made all of the difference between the 2011 strike and the 2013 resumption of the strike was that in 2013, a wide network of family support was marshaled to gain access to legislative processes. Insofar as what these strikes end up doing, if they reconnect to families and to supporters on the outside, they do so by frustrating the very forms of sequestration, confinement, and elimination that the prison tries to effectuate. But the differences, I think, matter quite a lot, too, in the nature of the appeal and the specific claims. So the claims coming out of the Texas strike right now are very within the current system of incarceration as present. There is no call for abolition. There is no call for release. There are call for specific reforms to specific practices directed towards parole, directed towards conditions of confinement, and it is made expressly to the powers that be, understanding the position they have in the capitalist production system as the lever point upon which they can make those demands. Whereas the strike call for the September 45th anniversary mass strike explicitly says we are not talking to supporters, we're talking to slaves to refuse the conditions of their enslavement. For me, this question then mirrors the debates which occur constantly within abolitionist communities and abolitionist organizers between demands for amelioration on the one hand and demands for abolition, and the connection or disconnection between those two. I don't want to settle that question because I think there's lots of people who've tried to do that, but I want to note that what seems to matter most, at least from the history of the practice of the GIP and from Foucault's own analysis in these lectures, is it matters a great deal from where these calls emerge. The question is who is making the demands more than it is the specific contents of the demands. And then so far as that the very rejection or articulation of what is intolerable is itself abolitionist in both method and in object. And so I want to argue that to articulate a set of intolerable statements, to make a series of demands, to give such demands when they're issued from the margins that are within is itself then an act of active intolerance, and therefore is also an abolitionist practice by mapping to the quotidian, the symbolic, the economic, and the political simultaneously. To demonstrate this, I want to cede the floor to Derek Quintero. who authored one of the intolerable statements that we published in Active Intolerance, in articulating a list of intolerables. Derek is currently incarcerated on death row in Riverbend Maximum Security Prison in Tennessee, and I'm just going to read his statement verbatim by way of closing. Illegitimate authority, self-righteous criticism, fear of change, fear of failure where it immobilizes you from trying, bullies, people who should know their breath stinks and still do not brush, fear of criticism, religious fanatics, anyone who thinks they have the ultimate answer, people who constantly spit food as they talk and eat, double standards, indoctrination to control thought, bigotry, incessant talking, lack of real community space, redundant architecture, overpriced art, overpriced necessities, destructive environmental practices, practices that do not respect individuals' right to life, liberty, and personal choice, corporate monopolies, not having truth in advertising laws for politicians, the continued practices of corruption in the judicial process, too serious people, people who are not serious enough, bean farts in confined spaces, waking up alone way too often, not enough beans in my diet.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much. I am sure you have some comments and some questions among yourselves. Also, in the light of the 7 questions that you asked yourselves, and that I am not entirely sure you even began to answer, right? But perhaps because in a certain way that was more like a platform to think something that goes beyond those 7 questions, and that go from that have addressed extremely fascinating and large subjects, from these new cynical philosophy going on to the very concept of intolerable that I find absolutely fascinating. I will go back home later and start reading the book you have edited, because I haven't read it. Shame on me, but I will fix that. And obviously sexuality, medicine, and racism. So perhaps you can begin this discussion among yourselves, because in a certain way I feel that you have surprised yourselves in this round table, right? Considering the questions you had at the beginning.
Harry, you want to pick this up?
I would love to go back and ask you in particular how, I mean, one of the things that I opened with and said I was thinking about but didn't go into was how, obviously with the shift in perspectives or treatment of illegalisms that's traced throughout the Punitive Society, and the construction of delinquency that then becomes highly productive through the prison system, there is repeatedly a shift in tolerance and a shift in intolerance that Foucault specifically locates within the bourgeoisie. So how is that intolerance connected to Foucault's intolerance, the cynical intolerance, the GIP intolerance, Derek's
list.
intolerance? What, I mean, I wonder if we can sharpen some of the, is it just the same thing but having different targets, or is the intolerance itself different in these cases? That's the one question I'm left with.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting because in the context of the cynics, and I didn't emphasize this, but in the context of the cynics, the intolerance is that towards the cynic, right? Mm-hmm. It's the intolerance of their insolence and of their actions and of their resistance, or their forms of resistance, or their frank speech, right? And so the word is flipped in that context. Yeah, and I'm not sure what to make of it. Whether it's a different concept completely, or whether there's a shared space of understanding somehow.
May I ask something about that?
Yeah.
Why did they articulate it in terms of intolerance? What was the political value of that concept at the time? Who was using that word in other words? So I remember very well how the word became current in Spanish political discussion from during the transition to democracy. Suddenly we discovered tolerance, and then suddenly we need to create some other sorts of venues to understand, to address this kind of tolerance. What kind of tolerance is it? So can we become intolerant somehow? Is there a political value in just reversing this word that has been playing a certain role in a certain political situation? I don't know. That's a question. It's a very loaded word that we are still discussing as a political concept in a certain way, right? So what is the genealogy of tolerance or toleration, and how to reverse this word in a productive way? How to scandalize, if you wish, with that concept?
I mean, there is this work in political theory that emerges, like from people like Andy Brown has talked about this to a certain degree, and Lawrence Lewanders on this, like just thinking of like how toleration becomes the paradigmatic liberal virtue in liberal societies, right? That what you have to do is work at this sort of second order level, but because we can't have an overlapping, or a basic understanding of the good, toleration or tolerance becomes the thing that allows us to live together with each other despite our completely different conceptions of the good. And then there is a critique of that, which is like, well, this is the space that liberal domination functions through, right? Because toleration becomes this prized virtue that can't be questioned, that it becomes the way you have to or cannot confront forms of overt domination because it's on the predication of a sort of weak multiculturalism of some kind. Right? But that feels different than what the GIP is doing, right? That feels like that's not exactly the critique that they're marshalling. But when I read the GIP documents and the interest in intolerable and the naming of the four issues of the pamphlet intolerable, right? And part of it then goes to like what it would mean to give up the floor is to note that the designation of those things which are not tolerable has to come from those for whom it's experiencing. And getting it right of what is and is not intolerable is less important than the fact that the claims of those intolerable things are already systematically judged by who's making that claim. Right? So prisoners are not allowed to articulate these demands, and if they do, they're dismissed as just all they care about is the food isn't good and that it's not warm enough. Right? So I was in LA County Jail, and it's under ACLU sort of consent agreement right now. And I was asking a sheriff about this while they're showing her my students around the space. Like, so what is it that the ACLU is doing inside here? It's like, well, they handle all the complaints now because the court said we weren't doing a good job. I was like, so what are the complaints? Like, oh, it's bullshit. Like, they just don't like the food. Right? And so the dismissiveness of that, being able to claim that like there's something intolerable happening to you, is predicated on the position within the system, not at all on like the substance of the claim itself. Which is what I like that Derek notes, like beans turns out to actually be an incredibly important thing under the conditions of confinement, right? But on both sides, too much and not enough. But I mean, that doesn't trace the genealogy and sort of that moment in France at the time, and I'm not sure like why it does or doesn't have the resonance that it does in the early 1970s.
But I would say that it's a term that I take it if one did some, it's a term that is very much identified in Foucault's own writings and his interviews, etc., with the turn from the archaeology of knowledge to the forms of genealogies of powers and relations of powers. And one could think of it as a form that a form that the resistance takes in connection with the particular kind of theoretical understandings that are taking place at the time. So in the 1960s, one could imagine in a space where an archaeology of knowledge is more dominant, that the forms of resistance are more a question of exposing the mechanisms of division, exposing the ways in which truth and falsity operate, right? And so one could imagine that the forms of resistance in that decade and in that context were related to showing all of the ways that that knowledge creates these divisions. And that would have been a different form of resistance than forms of intolerance that are somehow related to a deeper analysis of power relations, for instance. But that might then relate to the liberal political theoretic framework of tolerance, right? A dispersed, which one might think would also lead to the work on biopower and neoliberalism, which is an even more articulated theoretical development of tolerance, right? That neoliberal tolerance, right? Which would then trigger, I don't know, even sharper forms of resistance, like the ones you were talking about in terms of racism, in terms of war matrices, etc.
I'm interested in sort of the question related to this issue of thinking about a genealogy of tolerance or intolerance, and the relationship between that and the kind of differentiation or specificity in terms of particular bodies that Andrew was talking about, that Perry was talking about, and the tension between sort of this idea that there is something problematic about the sort of framework of exclusion or marginalizing, or right, sort of in the same sense, the prison affects all of us, the we, right? There's something that resists that kind of division, that strict division, and this sort of desire to locate a kind of the possibility of intolerance in very particular bodies, right? In very particular locations, that those who just sort of proclaim the intolerable and resist the intolerable, who tell us what is intolerable, have to be in particular locations relative to the construction of power.
I mean, the question we might ask is, like, why is the cynic intolerable, right? And that might be I don't know, that might be a clue as to how to enter that space. I don't know. But I know that some people, yeah.
I'm sure there may be other questions from the people around the table. Can you introduce yourself, please?
Pardon me?
Can you introduce yourself, please?
Oh, my name is Philip Goldstein. I'm an emeritus professor of English at the University of Delaware. I just happen to be in New York, and I'm very pleased to hear these papers. My knowledge of Foucault has something to do with the notion that people were critical of him, which is that he doesn't really leave room for resistance. It constructs a subject that's worked out by disciplines of power, and the subject is constructed in that way. And therefore, people say that the subject lacks self-consciousness. He can't, or she can't act in keeping with her own sort of will, personality. It's interesting to me that on these grounds, people think of Foucault as not being, or rejecting Marxism, whereas the last two papers both brought in Marxists to comment, Angela Davis, and also talked very explicitly about forms of resistance. So I'd like you to comment on that sort of objection to Foucault's notion of subject as to whether it leaves room for resistance or not, whether it's fair criticism.
I don't think it's a fair criticism of Foucault, right? And in part because at the one level in 76, and 75 and 76, it's that the account of power that Foucault gives is that the resistance is always present. And that this is the necessity of having an analytics of power, or a microphysics of power, which notes that wherever power is exercised, there is in fact resistance. Now, whether that's agentic resistance outside of power, that seems like that's now off the table on a sort of straightforward reading of the history of sexuality. But it means then you'd have to articulate forms of reversals of power, tactical reversals. This is where the questions of cynicism and ascesis comes up, of how you develop yourself in a way in relation to those forms of power. And in one sense, says the question gets moved, right? So it's not going to be about how do I escape, how do I get outside, how do I resist, in the sense of like power doesn't touch me. It's how do I, within the microphysics of power that I'm ensconced, do something other than what I may be expected to do or have to do. And the increasing difficulty of that, though, is that's part of what Foucault's diagnosis of the contemporary period takes us to. So maybe this connects, though, to the reference to neoliberalism, right? Because the particularly frightening thing, I think, about neoliberalism in Foucault's accounts in 79, at least, is that this is a mode of power that's really good at dealing with resistance and really good at incorporating it and turning it into surplus. So folks have noted, like, there's no higher achievement of sort of economic neoliberalism that we find ourselves in, that any dissident or countercultural or rejection of current sort of modes can't be turned into profit, can't be made back into a reinforcement of that. So in a certain degree, if you do end up at a place with Foucault where you can't really resist, it's not even the earlier Foucault, it's that later moment where what looks like resistance has been fully captured back by the system again. Which to a certain degree, though, I think is what's interesting about taking us back to forms of strike and general strike and the refusal or the withdrawal of cooperation, which is, I think, an older Marxist sort of language, but seems to have a different kind of potential than maybe it did before at the same time. The other sort of thing I think is there's this wonderful interview that was only just recently published and translated into English, where Foucault himself sort of says, like, Marx is all over my work. It's just I don't cite him. Because if I cite him, then all the Marxists think that I'm doing what he's doing. So he says, I have secret citations to Marx. And that's what he calls it, right? They're secret citations. And of course there's something happening there. But he disagrees, I think, with some basic tenets at that point. But did something else want to... That was way too fast of a gloss.
I think to pick up on something that Perry was referencing earlier, especially in sort of the interviews and documents surrounding the GIP, the sort of articulation of this kind of practice of intolerance is described as sort of located in the quotidian, in the everyday, right? In that passage that Perry read to us, so that there is a sense in which, specifically in this sort of set of texts, resistance is located in the sort of the refusal to sort of accept and internalize particular habits. That's something that comes up, for instance, in these lectures in particular. Right, the last few pages is a genealogy of habits and how they emerge, and how sort of habits instantiate a kind of way of life, and that the resistance to those sorts of, at that very sort of basic level of the ways in which we sort of eat, drink, have sex, right, at those really basic levels, that's where resistance is always happening. Same sense that Andrew, from the history of sexuality, where there's power, there's resistance, even in sort of the most quotidian.
So if you take seriously the idea at the heart of the GIP, and also at the heart of a lot of theoretical work, that one cannot speak for another, right? Then it makes it hard to define the intolerable for anyone but oneself, right? the GIP spoke in a voice of the intolerable, so it's not as if they weren't doing it. But I take it is difficult to, I don't know, it is difficult to speak of the intolerable in any objective terms.
So,
Which also, it's related to indignation
Mhm.
also, and other forms of social movements,
Yes.
right? That, I mean, in Spain, the movement, again, is one in which, I take it, no one's speaking for others, but it's coming from within the actors themselves, feeling a sense of indignation, right?
yes. So there is one question perhaps that is very important in the in your four comments, is the question of productivity of things that have normally a negative character, right? Like sequestration, or like repression, or like intolerable, or like, you know, all sorts of things, scandal, things or concepts that are so marked, or indignation, they are so marked with the subtraction of something that in a certain way impossibilitate you from seeing what they produce. And on the other hand, there is this turning around that question and say, well, perhaps that's exactly what we need to do to understand the productivity of the oxymoronic sort of critique. So it's look at not what we subtract, because that may be a strategy of production. And the question is, with those elements, with those negative concepts, sequestration, intolerance, indignation, etc., the point is to identify, so to speak, a list of indignant elements or intolerable or of intolerables, of sequestrations, etc., or modes of repression, or rather to just see the productive dynamics of the concept itself. So not to stop yourself from, once you have identified something that this is an intolerable, but rather to not stop it, to see, and that is not enough. It's the productive character of the whole concept, is the critical value of this procedure which is important. And in that sense, you never stop identifying. You cannot indignate yourself on behalf of somebody else. You cannot signal the intolerables of somebody else, or just produce a list of intolerables. You have to continue in this path, because that's critical one. I don't know. Does that make sense at all?
Yeah. And I think it ties those notions of indignation or intolerable not only to the self, right, but also to the way you lead your life, right? So it's got to be that it can't simply be tied to a self,
Right.
but has to be related to a way of interacting with the world. I take it, right?
Could you say, how did Foucault...
Can you introduce yourself first?
Okay, it's Stephen Paul Miller, professor of English at St. John's University.
Wonderful, thank you very much.
I'm sorry, I don't know Foucault's neoliberal essay, but how did he define neoliberal? Was it as we might understand a welfare state, or...
You published on this more recently.
Well, he was using mostly Gary Becker texts to understand neoliberalism. Yeah.
So it was sort of the way what we might call the modern welfare state, or...
No, it was more of the Chicago school.
Oh, okay, so it's more like the neo-con in a way.
Well, right. So, but it was focused on the application of of liberal economic thought in all domains.
Right. It's
So-
the old sense of liberal. The kind of maybe pre-Adam Smith even sense of liberal. So.
Yes, but brought to the contemporary with the Chicago School. I mean, but the focus there was on kind of the market as being the source of, or the measure of truth.
The
Right,
grid of
right.
intelligibility, this is one of the reasons, right? So
Right.
the market becomes how you make truth claims across domains, right? So in that sense, different from classical liberalism in the sense that there's a set of domains of market moments and then state moments, but the complete subsumption, not just of state, but all aspects of life to market rationality.
So a couple of
marriage markets and adoption markets and anything is a market.
So definitely. So a couple of quick questions. Like I would think that some of the assumptions of, I'm not a Foucault expert, but I think of that of Foucault as undermining what we might call the modern liberal welfare state, in the same way as your statement that whatever you contribute to will be used against you. That wouldn't surprise me as a kind of Foucauldian thought.
I mean, there's this fight that's sort of going on right now about so is he or isn't he, was Foucault a neoliberal himself or was he not? It's developed sort of a cottage industry of like that sort of question. And a lot of it hinges on whether or not he's an opponent of the modern welfare state or he's in fact a supporter of it. Like, that's sort of one of the ways it gets taken up. I think one of the things that's important that Foucault adds to that conversation, which people like David Harvey don't explicitly are connecting themselves to quite so much, is like, this is happening actually at the level of subjectivity. And it's happening at the level of how the self understands the self in relation to activities that they actually engage in.
Right.
And less even about governmental policy per se.
So in terms of making Foucault permanent, right? If we look at it at 2016, a lot of what we thought of, that the new left might have thought of 40 years ago or whatever, as the modern welfare state, as irrelevant, the New Deal is relevant, whatever. It now seems undeniably relevant. We need certain government protections. The government security state's one thing, and whatever you want to call the new deal is a whole other thing, right? Do you see, how would you see Foucault working? I mean, I could sort of see a point, and if the prison is an analog of a certain kind of wage slavery, you want to overcome both of them.
Right.
So what would the positive analog, what would be Foucauldian ways of doing that, more, that you could see in Foucault?
Yeah, so I mean, I think one thing with a thinker like Foucault is that you always have to try and locate texts because he was someone who thought differently at different times, and so I don't think it would be possible to speak about a Foucauldian take on that. And I think instead we would need to look at particular texts and the way in which he's engaging them. I would throw on the table a nice little text, though, that I discovered as I was reading the GIP materials that could relate to this. And it's in a radio interview he gave on Radio Canada in April of 1971. That's the passage where he talks about the incredibly medieval and archaic prisons in France. And then he says, and this is really interesting, so this is April 71. So basically, he's finished the lectures on the will to know. The GIP is in action, formed in February, whatever. And he's talking about the archaic prisons, and he says, I hold in principle that all repression is bad, toute répression est mauvaise. I also hold equally in principle that every state is repressive. And from there I conclude that every state is bad. And there's laughter and reported on the radio. And then the interviewer asks him, so are you saying that you're an anarchist? Right? And then he says, well, maybe not absolutely. Simply, and I wonder, je me demande, if the forms of the state that we've known up till now, the forms of the state that have been developed in history since, for instance, antiquity, ancient Greece, are the only forms of social organization to which one could refer oneself. And he says maybe what we would need to do probably is to think of other types of social organization. So if so there's a bit of an answer right there, but it's located in April 71. There would be a different kind of an answer in 79, I think.
It's the kind of thought, William James thinks of the moral equivalence of war and a different kind of a war associated with social welfare instead of war, that sort of thought, and which actually went into informing the New Deal in a lot of ways.
Right.
If you think of intolerable, just like a really quick example would be Taft-Hartley, which makes it almost, very difficult to unionize. Makes unions, the right to unionize intolerable. If I could, I'm not phrasing it correctly, but it takes back the Wagner Act. The Wagner Act makes unions tolerable. Taft-Hartley makes them intolerable. And it's an important, almost Marxian sort of thing.
Some more people.
Joseph?
Yeah.
Professor Cisneros, when you spoke about the fluidity of strategies of sequestration and how eventually the surplus of that fluidity would lead to their partial evacuation from state control, I was thinking about what I've heard termed as kind of the carceral continuum. And what I'm specifically interested in is the sequestration on the ontological level, in terms of how, when we can sequester bodies by permanently removing them from what we see or experience. And so my interest here in particular is dating applications. On many dating applications, you have the capacity to permanently remove or sequester the person's visual body from the field of the visible, which I've always taken as a consequence to remove them from the field of the ontological. You've sort of denied them viability as a sexual agent. And so I'm wondering, how do you see sequestration and punitiveness, carceral logics, how do we see them expanding, I guess in a neoliberal way, pushing into these, what should be non-punitive spaces, but routinely and vigorously reactivate relations of domination and hierarchy along many identitarian lines?
This is a great question. I think that this is really interesting, especially because in the first of the lectures, which I discussed briefly at the beginning, Foucault talks about sort of this term like marginalization or exclusion, and he talks about, right, like as I discussed, its shortcomings in terms of a schema with which to analyze sort of carceral structures of power. But the place in which he does think that it's helpful is in describing the way that particular bodies, and remember he lists sort of like ethnic, sexual minorities, etc., from the field of representation, right? So in this sense, I think this can speak directly to sort of that even though, right, like as you're sort of implying or you're surely saying, there are all sorts of kinds of strategies of power that are at work in sort of on the bodies and sort of forming the abnormal, or however we want to talk about the bodies that are undesirable and are removed from like this kind of field representation. Marginalization or exclusion is a sort of a helpful way of revealing that sort of invisibility. So I hope that's helpful, but that was really helpful for me in sort of crystallizing that particular.
That's sort of what I've been thinking. I thought this was just so helpful for me, all four of you, for thinking about how punitiveness expands and latches on to other spaces, because it's not so much that this. I always think of it as logics, as an operational logics that's very, very effective and very easily assimilated into spaces where I would never, where I certainly wouldn't want to see it.
I wonder if I could actually follow up, because your exchange made me I want to ask you a question that I wanted to ask you since you started working on the eliminated element here. So I'm thinking of the process, the eliminative function, yes, of the punitive and how it works in sequestration. And I'm thinking of the bathroom bills in the South right now. And I'm thinking, so there are these places, these eliminative places, which we might characterize restrooms as being eliminative places for individual bodies. That then becomes this place of elimination for eliminative social function, right? And sequestration and punishment in this place where you don't expect it, in a sense, an everyday public place.
Public, kind of public, not public.
Right, public restroom. That's it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
We need to take out two last questions because time is running quite quickly. So we have two more questions.
Okay.
One from Kalinka and another one from you. Is that good?
Yeah, I was just trying to still think about the notion of intolerable, and I don't know exactly the history and how they show these how the GIP shows this title to, but I think it's interesting that we talked about it because it's a word that there is the joint of many actors actually, because if the goal of the GIP and the GIP journal was to give create a space for the prisoners' voices, it's been created by intellectuals and scholars. So they chose this title, I guess. And that's I think it's interesting also to think about it as in relationship with Mai 68, Mai 68, because there's in a sense, I mean, some people, Deleuze said that somehow Mai 68 missed the question of the prisons. So I think it's something also that I cannot avoid the thinking that behind this word intolerable, there's this claim to reconsider, to put prisons in the general definition of what is intolerable at this moment of French history. So I was curious about also talking a little bit about the connection between these events.
Well, I mean, part of the GIP, in one sense, is responding to the increased incarceration of individuals following Mai 68, right? And so some of the specifically Maoist practices that they're engaged with, like the questionnaire investigation sort of style, like there's some strong, I think, historical connections between who was now suddenly finding themselves in prison, right, following Mai 68, and then when the GIP emerges, when it does. And there's this sort of the strange thing I think that happens too, where the GIP becomes sort of canonized as this intellectual-led movement, when its membership was far broader than the folks that we end up seeing the photographs of Deleuze and Sartre and Foucault, and that it was mostly made up of formerly incarcerated individuals, and incarcerated individuals who were part of the GIP, but they were inside and they never identified themselves, and family members, right? And this becomes key to the first round of the investigations, right? So the first intolerable pamphlet is 20 investigations inside the prison, or investigations inside 20 prisons. And it's entirely based on questionnaires and surveys that are being smuggled into the prison primarily by family members, who are only some of the few people who have access to folks on the inside. Right? So there's something interesting about like how we also remember the GIP as this intellectual movement. Part of it has to do with like the address, right? It becomes so attached to Foucault because it's his address at the end of the manifesto as where to come with your claims of the intolerable. But Perry, did you want to add, I mean, like the specific 68 connections?
Just that they specifically, what jumped to mind then was that they specifically characterized this questionnaire as an intolerance investigation. in contrast to a curiosity investigation. It's not just that I want to know.
Yeah.
It's that I want, yes, the prison to be taken into a kind of visibility and accountability that it doesn't have right now.
Part of this is there's just no access to French prisons, right? And so, I mean, this is, I think, why, Foucault, the first time he's ever been in prison is in the United States. The U.S. has a much stranger accessibility to these institutions compared to France, especially.
Yeah, the only other thing I would add there is that, I mean, there are the direct links from '68 insofar as the entire way in which this becomes an issue is through the incarceration of the militant Maoists who end up in the prison, and then questions about what to challenge, right? Do you challenge this as a political prisoner? Do you challenge it as common law prisoners? Do you challenge it, the prison as a whole? And so all of those questions are being debated at the time, the debate with the Maoists, etc., the debate between Deleuze and Foucault. So there are all those direct links, and then also, of course, overlaying that is the fact that most everyone is trying to understand power in a post-'68 period, right? So that's what's going on for someone like Foucault. I mean, he's trying to understand what happened in '68 and why the movement didn't have the results it could have had in a kind of, post-commune kind of way. And of course, Deleuze and Guattari are coming up with their explanation in Anti-Oedipus, and Foucault's explanation, or Foucault's theoretical take, is Discipline and Punish, which is an analysis. So you've got multiple different layers of interweaving that are, in fact, pretty much all related to '68, right? And pretty much all of the wake of '68.
A third strain, though, is important, and Brady Heiner has done some of this work, noting that the Black Panther movement in the United States and the specific connections between intellectual leaders like Angela Davis studying Casa, right, is actually really important too. And reading some of the GIP documents, you start to see like the early articulations of what ends up being Discipline and Punish are already there, but it's not actually coming from Foucault, it's coming from prisoners articulating the experience of incarceration. So you get the power resistance language starts showing up in some of the intolerance inquiries as well. Right? So I think that trajectory is going to as well.
So then the other question is, I'll just articulate it, and then maybe we'll take it downstairs, okay? Because we do need to close, and we're over already. But I think that throughout the talks, I was really interested in the question of what role for the critical thinker today in the context of something like the Texas prison strike right now. And there were these different models that come out. I mean, the first one I was thinking about, of course, is the cynic, right, who's challenging in the way that only the cynic does everything about the conventions, but also trying to use those challenges to render independent others or to teach others in a way. I mean, Harry, in your discussion, you also referenced Dr. Rose, who was very important. That was the person who avowed. She was the psychiatrist at Toul, and referenced the fact that she was the only one who Daniel Defer referred to as a specific intellectual, right? But there's another model there, which is the avowing from a place of experience one has. Angela Davis, Natalie, in your talk, Angela Davis sticks out as a figure who is important here as a possible model of the public intellectual. I take it in identifying the particular American genealogy that needs to be excavated, right, or for putting fingers on the unique relation to slavery. And then Andrew, of course, in yours throughout, I was thinking of, how do we engage? What do we contribute now that this strike, right, I mean, is a successful expression, it seems to me, of those who are in prison, right? And then the question becomes, how can we as critical thinkers contribute to this? So maybe what we should do is turn it over back to Jesus and end the conversation. End the conversation here.
I hate
now.
to end the conversation.
Yeah, yeah. But try and maybe we can focus on that
Yes.
in the ensuing discussion downstairs.
Correct, because now my way of ending this conversation, other than thanking you for this fantastic, for those contributions and for this fantastic discussion that ends up with so many questions, is to offer you a little bit of a drink and food downstairs so that we continue a little bit this conversation. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.